Welcome to Midnight Whispers, the place where small towns speak louder in silence than big cities ever could. On the surface, they're perfect. Kids playing in the park, neighbors waving hello, and streets so still you can hear your own footsteps echo. But under that calm lies a pulse you can't ignore. The abandoned house everyone avoids. The trail no one dares to walk at night. The strange figures seen in the same spot, year after year. These are more than rumors. They're the lived moments of real people, stitched into legends and warnings passed down. If you're just finding us, subscribe and turn on notifications, because every week we open the doors to places most would rather keep shut. And now, the doors are creaking open. Let's step inside. Story 1. Pennsylvania Labyrinth. I went into the Pennsylvania woods to find my brother, but the forest had already claimed him by the time I arrived. The state police found his body 3 days after I reported him missing, hanging from a white oak deep in what locals call the labyrinth. Michael had been hiking alone, something he'd done hundreds of times without incident. He was experienced, carried GPS, always told someone his planned route. But the note in his backpack, written in his own handwriting, said he couldn't find his way out and couldn't bear the weight of what he was carrying anymore. The thing is, my brother had never been depressed, never mentioned feeling trapped or hopeless. 2 weeks before his death, he'd been planning a vacation, talking about buying a new house, excited about life in ways I hadn't seen in years. I decided to hike his final route myself, convinced there had to be more to the story. The trail he'd chosen was marked and well-maintained, cutting through dense Appalachian forest about 40 miles east of Pittsburgh. Nothing that should have confused an experienced hiker, but within an hour of starting, I understood why they called it the labyrinth. The trees grew differently here, closer together, their branches interweaving overhead until daylight barely penetrated the canopy. The forest floor was carpeted with decades of undisturbed leaves, muffling every sound until my own footsteps seemed to come from somewhere else entirely. More disturbing was how the trail seemed to shift when I wasn't paying attention. I stopped to check my compass, look up, and find myself facing a path I could have sworn wasn't there moments before. The GPS on my phone showed me moving in straight lines, but my eyes told me the trail curved and twisted like a living thing. By noon, I was completely disoriented. The trail markers I'd been following had either vanished or changed somehow. Instead of the familiar blue blazes marking the official path, I kept seeing scratches in the bark that looked almost like desperate fingernail marks. It's when I started feeling it. The weight Michael had written about in his note. It began as a heaviness in my chest, like breathing air that was too thick. Then came the certainty that I made terrible mistakes, hurt people I cared about, failed at everything that mattered. Memories I buried years ago surfaced with crystal clarity. Every harsh word I'd ever spoken, every promise I'd broken, every moment when I could have been better but chose not to be. The forest amplified these feelings until they became unbearable. I sat down on a fallen log, overwhelmed by guilt and shame that felt far too intense for their actual causes. It was like someone had turned up the volume on every regret I ever had until they became a screaming chorus in my head. But I wasn't alone in feeling this way. As I sat there fighting waves of inexplicable despair, I started noticing things in my peripheral vision. Movement that disappeared when I looked directly at it. Shapes that might have been people, standing perfectly still between distant trees. The shapes were watching me. I could feel their attention like a physical weight, pressing down on my shoulders and making it hard to lift my head. When I finally managed to look up, they were gone, but the feeling of being observed remained, along with a growing certainty that these watchers were not entirely human anymore. I found the first body purely by accident. While trying to locate the main trail, I pushed through a thick stand of mountain laurel and nearly stepped on what remained of a hiker. The corpse was old, maybe 6 months, reduced to bones and tattered clothing. But what stopped my breath was the position of the skeleton. The arms were stretched upward, finger bones still clutching a rope that hung from the branch above. This person had died the same way as Michael, but their body had never been found, never been reported. How many others were hanging in these woods, invisible to search parties, claimed by whatever force made people lose hope so completely they couldn't take another step forward? I started looking more carefully as I walked, scanning the canopy for signs of other victims. What I found was worse than I imagined. Dozens of ropes hanging from sturdy branches, some empty now, their burdens long since fallen to the forest floor. Others still occupied by remains in various stages of decay. The Pennsylvania Labyrinth wasn't just a place where people got lost and killed themselves. It was a collection point, a trap that drew in anyone carrying emotional pain and amplified that suffering until death seemed like the only escape. But the most horrible discovery was yet to come. I found Michael's campsite in a small clearing, exactly where he planned to spend his final night. His tent was still standing, sleeping bag laid out, camp stove assembled as if he'd just stepped away for a few minutes. But he'd been dead for over a week. Inside the tent, I found his journal. The early entries were normal, documenting his hike, noting wildlife sightings, complaining about sore feet. But the tone changed dramatically once he entered the deep forest. He wrote about feeling watched, about the overwhelming sadness that seemed to seep up from the ground itself, about hearing voices in the wind that sounded like people calling for help, but when he tried to follow them, he only got more lost. The final entries were barely legible, written in shaking handwriting that grew more erratic with each page. He described seeing people hanging from every tree, their faces turned toward him with expressions of profound relief. He wrote that they were calling to him, explaining how peaceful it was, how all the pain stopped once you joined them. But the last entry, dated the day before police found his body, contained something that made my blood freeze. Michael had written about seeing me in the forest, about watching me hike the same trail, make the same mistakes, feel the same crushing despair that had driven him to his final decision. According to his journal, he'd been following me for days, trying to warn me away from the deeper woods. But every time he got close, I disappeared like smoke, and he realized I wasn't really there yet. I was a vision of the future, a preview of the next victim the forest had chosen. Reading this, I understood what Michael had discovered in his final hours. The Pennsylvania Labyrinth didn't just kill people who wandered into it. It showed them the deaths of others who would follow, creating an endless cycle of despair that stretched forward through time. I was exactly where he'd see me in his vision. Standing in his campsite, reading his journal, feeling the same crushing weight of hopelessness that had driven him to find that rope. The voices started then, soft whispers coming from the trees around the clearing. Michael's voice mixed with dozens of others, all explaining how simple it would be to end the pain. How the forest would take care of everything, make sure I was never really alone. I could see them now, hanging from branches that should have been empty. Michael and all the others, swaying gently in a breeze that didn't touch the living. Their faces were peaceful, finally free from whatever burdens had driven them into these woods. The rope was already there, waiting on a low branch just like Michael had described. All I had to do was reach for it, and the crushing weight in my chest would finally lift. But something made me hesitate. A memory of Michael laughing at a stupid joke, the way he always found reasons to keep going even when things got hard. He wouldn't want me to follow him. Not like this. I ran from that clearing like my life depended on it, which it probably did. Crashed through underbrush without caring about trails or directions, just trying to get away from the voices that promised peace through surrender. By some miracle, I stumbled back onto the main trail just as the sun was setting. The oppressive weight lifted from my chest the moment I crossed onto the marked path, like stepping out of a heavy fog I hadn't to realize was there. I reported what I found to the authorities, but they dismissed most of it as grief-induced hallucinations. The Forest Service did send teams to recover the remains I described, but their reports were heavily redacted, and the area was quietly closed to public access shortly afterward. Michael's death was ruled a suicide, case closed. But I know better. He didn't kill himself because he was depressed or lost. He was murdered by a place that feeds on human suffering, that collects the hopeless and the heartbroken like trophies. The Pennsylvania Labyrinth is still out there, still hungry. And sometimes, late at night, I wonder if Michael was right about seeing the future. If somewhere in those dark woods, my own death is already hanging from a tree, waiting for the day when my pain becomes too heavy to carry alone. Story 2. Weight of silence. I never believed in ghosts until I spent 3 nights in the Villisca Axe Murder House. What I experienced there changed everything I thought I knew about the darkness that lurks in forgotten corners of America. My name is David, and I document paranormal activity for my YouTube channel. I had been planning this investigation for months, but nothing could have prepared me for what waited inside that cursed Iowa farmhouse where 8 innocent people were butchered in their sleep over a century ago. The house sits on a quiet street in Villisca, Iowa, looking deceptively normal. White clapboard siding, a simple front porch, windows that stare out like dead eyes. But the moment I stepped through that front door, the air itself felt wrong. Heavy, thick with something I could not name but could feel pressing against my chest. The floorboards creaked under my feet as I entered the living room where the Moore family had lived their final day in June 1912. 6 children and 2 adults, all murdered with an axe while they slept. The killer was never found. The case remains unsolved to this day. I set up my equipment methodically. Cameras in every room, audio recorders, electromagnetic field detectors, all the tools of a modern ghost hunter. But as I worked, I could not shake the feeling that something was watching me from the shadows that gathered in the corners despite my bright LED lights. The first night, I tried to stay rational. Every strange sound had an explanation. The house settling, wind through loose boards, mice in the walls. But around 2 in the morning, I heard something that made my blood freeze. Footsteps above my head, slow and deliberate, pacing back and forth across the children's bedroom. I grabbed my camera and climbed the narrow staircase, each step groaning under my weight. The hallway stretched before me, darker than it should have been despite my flashlight. The children's room door stood open, but when I stepped inside, the footsteps stopped. The silence was worse than any sound. 4 small beds lined the walls, the same beds where Lena, Ina, Catherine, and Boyd Stillinger had been found with their skulls crushed. I swept my flashlight across the room, but found nothing. Just empty beds and shadows that seemed to move when I was not looking directly at them. That is when I noticed the temperature had dropped 20 degrees. My breath came out in visible puffs as I set up my camera to record the room overnight. But as I adjusted the tripod, I heard something that made my hands shake. A child's voice, so faint I almost missed it, whispering my name. David. I spun around, but the room was empty. My heart hammered against my ribs as I checked every corner, every shadow. Nothing, but the voice had been real. I had heard it as clearly as my own breathing. The second night was worse. I had barely fallen asleep on the living room couch when something yanked the blanket off my body. I jolted awake to find the room ice cold, my breath forming clouds in the frigid air. But it was the middle of July. The house should have been sweltering. I reached for my flashlight, but my hand froze when I saw the kitchen doorway. A shadow stood there, tall and impossibly dark, darker than the darkness around it. It had the shape of a man, but something was wrong with its proportions. Its arms hung too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. I could not move, could not breathe. The shadow watched me with what I somehow knew were eyes, though I could see no features in its face. We stared at each other across that room where a family had eaten their last meal, and I felt something cold and alien pressing against my mind. Then it moved. Not walked, moved. It flowed across the floor like smoke, but with purpose, with intelligence. It stopped at the foot of the couch where I lay paralyzed, and I felt its presence like a weight settling over me. The air grew so cold it hurt to breathe. That is when I smelled it, the metallic scent of blood, thick and fresh, as if the murders had happened moments ago instead of over a century past. My stomach lurched, but I still could not move, could not look away from the thing standing over me. It leaned down, and though I could see no face, I felt breath that smelled of decay against my cheek. Then it whispered in a voice like grinding stone, "You should not have come here." The shadow vanished, and suddenly I could move again. I gasped, rolled off the couch, and scrambled for my equipment. But when I checked the cameras, they had all stopped recording at exactly 2:17 a.m. The same time the murders had occurred in 1912. By the third night, I should have left. Every instinct screamed at me to pack my gear and drive back to Chicago. But I had to know what was happening in that house. I had to understand why the darkness felt so alive, so hungry. I decided to spend the night in the parents' bedroom, where Josiah and Sarah Moore had died. The room felt different from the others. Not just haunted, but infected. As if something malevolent had taken root there and grown stronger over the decades. I lay on the floor where their bed had once stood, staring up at the ceiling. The house was silent, but it was not the peaceful silence of an empty building. It was the silence of held breath, of something waiting. At midnight, the scratching began. Slow, deliberate scratches in the walls around me, like fingernails dragging across wood. But not random scratches. They had pattern, rhythm, almost like Morse code, but in no language I recognized. I sat up, trying to locate the source of the sound, when I noticed something that made my throat close with fear. The scratches were spelling something. Letters carved into the wallpaper by invisible hands. HELPUS. More scratches appeared, faster now, more frantic. TRAPPED. CANNOTLAVE. My flashlight beam shook as I tried to follow the words appearing on the walls around me. The temperature plummeted again, and I heard voices. Not one voice, but many. Men, women, children, all whispering at once, their words overlapping into a chorus of desperation. Help us, help us, help us. We cannot leave, we cannot leave, we cannot leave. It has us, it has us, it has us. The voices grew louder, more urgent, until they were not whispers but screams. The scratching became violent, deep gouges appearing in the walls as invisible hands clawed at the wood in panic. That is when I understood. The people killed in this house had never left, but they were not ghosts as I had imagined ghosts to be. They were prisoners, trapped by something that fed on their terror, their pain, their endless replay of that horrible night. And now it wanted me too. The shadow appeared again, but this time it was not alone. Smaller shadows gathered around it. Children, its shadows, with their heads tilted at wrong angles. They moved toward me, reaching out with hands that stretched too far, fingers that bent in directions fingers should not bend. I ran. I crashed down the stairs, stumbled through the living room, and burst through the front door into the Iowa night. Behind me, the house erupted with sound. Screaming, scratching, the thunder of footsteps chasing me across every room. I threw my equipment into my car and drove away as fast as I could, not looking back until Villisca was miles behind me. But as I drove through the dark Iowa countryside, I realized something that made my hands shake on the steering wheel. The voices were still with me, faint whispers in the back of my mind, growing stronger each day since I left that house. Sometimes I catch myself scratching words into surfaces without realizing it. Always the same message. Help us. I know now that the thing in the Villisca house collects people. Not their bodies, but something deeper. Their essence, their souls. And I think I brought a piece of it home with me. The scratching in my wall started 3 days ago. The shadows in my apartment have grown darker, more solid. And sometimes, late at night, I hear children whispering my name. I am telling you this story because I need you to understand. If you ever find yourself in a small Iowa town, if you ever see a white farmhouse with dead windows staring out at the street, if you ever feel the urge to spend the night in the Villisca Axe Murder House, do not do it. Some doors should never be opened. Some places should be left alone. Because once you step inside, once you breathe that poisoned air and feel those watching eyes, you might find that you can never truly leave. The whispers are getting louder now. The shadows are getting closer. And I am starting to understand that the real horror of the Villisca house is not what happened there over a century ago. It is what is still happening, what will always be happening. In that house where time stopped at 2:17 a.m. on June 10, 1912. And where the darkness has been growing hungry ever since. Story 3. Bell Witch Confession. The thing about Adams, Tennessee is that everyone knows the story, but nobody talks about what really happened to my family last October. I came to Adams researching the Bell Witch legend for a documentary I never finished. What started as a weekend trip to interview locals about 19th century folklore became 3 weeks of pure hell that ended with my brother dead and my sanity hanging by a thread. The Bell Witch Cave sits just outside town, a tourist attraction now, complete with gift shop and guided tours. But the real story ISN, about John Bell and his family from 1817. The real story is about what never left that cave, and why it has been feeding on visitors for over 2 centuries. I should have noticed the warning signs immediately. The motel clerk who booked my room avoided eye contact when I mentioned the cave. The waitress at the diner who went silent when I asked about local Bell Witch sightings. The way conversation stopped whenever I walked into a room. Small towns protect their secrets, but Adams was protecting something else entirely. My first visit to the cave was routine. Standard tourist experience, complete with cheesy sound effects and plastic skeletons. The guide, a teenager named Marcus, rattled off the usual story about Kate Bats cursing the Bell family, the mysterious voice that tormented them, and John Bell's eventual death from poison administered by the witch herself. But as we stood in the deepest part of the cave, Marcus whispered something the other tourists couldn't hear. He told me to come back after dark if I wanted to experience something real. He gave me a key to the back entrance and warned me not to bring anyone else. I should have recognized it as bait. That night, I returned alone with my recording equipment. The cave felt different in absolute darkness, older somehow, like the limestone walls were holding their breath. My flashlight beam seemed weaker than it should have been, swallowed by shadows that moved independently of my movements. The temperature dropped 20 degrees the moment I crossed the threshold. I'd been in the cave for maybe 10 minutes when my equipment started malfunctioning. The digital recorder picked up voices that weren't there, whispered conversations in what sounded like Old English. My camera captured movement in empty spaces, figures that appeared and vanished between frames. Then I heard my name. Not called out, not shouted, but spoken in a conversational tone as if someone was standing right beside me. A woman's voice, clear and articulate, with an accent I couldn't place. She knew things about me that no one in Adams could possibly know. My childhood address, my ex-wife, this maiden name, the reason I really come to Tennessee. I was running from something back home, and somehow the voice in the cave knew exactly what it was. She told me I wasn't the first person to seek her out. Every few years, someone would come looking for the Bell Witch, drawn by curiosity or desperation or some combination of both. Most of them left town quickly, spooked by minor encounters and strange coincidences. But a few stayed longer, tried to dig deeper into the mystery. Those people never left Adams at all. Over the following days, the encounters escalated. Objects in my motel room would be moved while I was out. My rental car would be found parked in different locations than where I left it. Food would disappear from my mini fridge, replaced by items I never purchased. But the worst part was the knowledge. The voice, which had begun calling itself Kate, knew things about my past that I never told anyone. She knew about the accident that killed my daughter, about the drinking problem that destroyed my marriage, about the documentary project that was really just an excuse to run away from my responsibilities. She knew I'd been planning to end my life when I finished the film. Kate began appearing to me outside the cave, manifesting as a shimmer of heat that distorted the air around her. She could move objects, manipulate electronics, and most disturbing of all, she could make me feel physical sensations without touching me. Pressure on my chest, pain in my joints, the sensation of fingers running through my hair. She was getting stronger. The breaking point came when my brother David drove down from Nashville to check on me. I'd been in Adams for 2 weeks by then, and my phone calls home had become increasingly erratic. He was worried about my mental state, concerned that I was having another breakdown. David was always the practical one, the skeptic who explained away everything supernatural with logic and reason. When I tried to tell him about Kate, he assumed I was drinking again. When objects moved in front of him, he looked for hidden wires and mirrors. Even when Kate spoke directly to him, calling him by name and reciting details from his childhood, he insisted it was some kind of elaborate hoax designed to exploit grieving documentary filmmakers. That stubbornness killed him. Kate didn't like being dismissed. She spent 2 centuries terrifying believers, but skeptics presented a different kind of challenge. David became her primary target, subjected to increasingly violent manifestations that he continued to explain away even as they escalated beyond any reasonable doubt. She slammed doors in his face, shattered windows around him, and filled his hotel room with the smell of sulfur. She made his food taste like ash and turned his tap water black. She whispered threats in his ear while he slept and left scratches on his arms that spelled out obscene messages. David documented everything with his phone, convinced he was gathering evidence of an elaborate conspiracy. He planned to expose the whole thing, to reveal how the town of Adams was systematically terrorizing visitors to maintain their supernatural tourism industry. He never got the chance. On his 4th night in Adams, David went to the Bell Witch Cave alone. He wanted to film in the same location where I had my first encounter, to prove that the supernatural experiences could be replicated through simple stagecraft and suggestion. I found his body the next morning, positioned at the exact spot where John Bell allegedly died in 1820. No wounds, no signs of struggle, but his face was frozen in an expression of absolute terror. The coroner ruled it a heart attack brought on by extreme stress, but David was 38 years old with no history of heart problems. His phone was found beside him, still recording. The final video showed him setting up his equipment in the cave, explaining his theory about local conspiracies and tourist traps. Then, abruptly, the camera angle shifted as if someone had grabbed the phone from his hands. For the next 47 minutes, the video captured David, his voice pleading with something unseen, begging for mercy, promising to leave town and never return. His breathing became more labored as the recording progressed, punctuated by gasping sounds and what might have been sobbing. In the final minutes, a woman's voice could be clearly heard responding to his pleas. Kate's voice, calm and conversational, explaining that skeptics had to be dealt with more harshly than believers. They required proof that couldn't be denied or explained away. The recording ended with David screaming. I left Adams the same day, but Kate followed me home to Chicago. She has been with me for 6 months now, a constant presence that grows stronger every time I tell someone what happened in Tennessee. She feeds on attention, on the fear and fascination of people who hear the story and want to know more. She wants me to go back to Adams to finish the documentary I started. She is promised to leave me alone if I bring her more visitors, more people who will seek her out and give her the recognition she craves. She is tired of being a local legend, limited to terrorizing the occasional tourist. Kate wants to be famous. I've tried ignoring her, tried moving apartments, tried surrounding myself with religious artifacts and protective symbols. Nothing works. She is not bound by the rules that govern other supernatural entities. She is something older and more adaptable, something that is learned to evolve with the times. The Bell Witch trapped in that cave in Adams, Tennessee. She never was. The cave is just her anchor point, the place where she is strongest, but her influence extends far beyond the limestone walls where she first made herself known. She has been collecting people for 2 centuries, building a network of the desperate and the curious, the believers and the skeptics alike. Everyone who encounters her becomes part of her story, whether they survive the experience or not. David was just the latest in a long line of victims, and I am about to become the next. Because I decided to go back to Adams, not to film a documentary or to expose the truth, but to end this cycle once and for all. Kate has made it clear that she'll never stop following me, never stop tormenting me, until I bring her what she wants. But what she doesn't know is that I've been researching ways to trap entities like her, ways to bind supernatural forces to specific locations so they can spread their influence any further. It might work, or it might just make her angrier. Either way, I want to be leaving Tennessee alive. If you re-listening to this recording, it means I failed. It means Kate is still active, still looking for new victims to add to her collection. She'll probably use my story to lure more documentary filmmakers and paranormal investigators to Adams, people who think they can succeed where I fail. Dawn, to go looking for the Bell Witch Cave. Dawn, to try to contact Kate or challenge her existence. Some legends are better left alone, and some small towns are hiding secrets that were never meant to be exposed. Adams, Tennessee looks peaceful enough during the day, but it has been feeding the thing in that cave for over 200 years. Every visitor, every tourist, every curious researcher adds to her power and helps her reach a little further into the outside world. The Bell Witch isn't just a local legend anymore. She is growing stronger, spreading her influence, and looking for new places to call home. She might already be watching you. Story 4. Harvest. I found the first body hanging from a corn stalk on my 40th birthday. The irony wasn't lost on me, even as I stood there in the Nebraska heat, staring at what used to be a man my age. He swayed gently in the morning breeze, his work boots barely touching the dusty ground between the rows of corn. A hand-painted sign hung around his neck with childish lettering that made my blood turn cold. He who walks behind the rows does not suffer the old to live. I was driving cross-country, trying to clear my head after the divorce, when my GPS died somewhere outside of Grand Island. The last road sign I'd seen pointed toward a place called Gatlin, population 847. That was 3 hours ago. Now I was lost in a maze of cornfields that stretched to the horizon in every direction, and I just discovered that Gatlin had at least one fewer resident than advertised. The dead man couldn't have been hanging there long. His skin was still pink, not gray, and the flies hadn't found him yet. But his eyes were gone, not pecked out by birds or rotted away, carved out, clean and deliberate, like someone had used a melon baller to scoop them from his skull. I should have turned around right then. Should have driven until I hit pavement and civilization and people who didn't, to hang their neighbors from farming equipment. But my car was running on fumes, and the corn seemed to go on forever. I had to find Gatlin. Had to find gas and answers, and maybe a sheriff who could explain what the hell was happening in this forgotten corner of America. The town appeared suddenly, like it had been hiding behind the corn until the last possible moment. One minute I was surrounded by endless stalks. The next I was driving down Main Street past a weathered water tower and a grain elevator that looked like it hadn't operated since the Great Depression. Gatlin was the kind of place that time forgot. False front buildings lined both sides of the street, their paint peeling in the harsh prairie sun. A few pickup trucks sat parked at odd angles, like their drivers had abandoned them mid-errand. But what struck me most was the silence. No dogs barking, no air conditioners humming, no sound at all except the whisper of wind through corn. I pulled up to the only gas station, a rusted shell sign creaking on its post. The pumps looked ancient, the kind where you had to go inside to pay first. But the building was dark, a handwritten sign in the window reading, "Gone to harvest, back soon." In that same childish scrawl I'd seen in the cornfield. That is when I noticed the children. They stood at the edge of the corn across from the gas station, maybe a dozen of them, ranging from what looked like 6 years old to their late teens. They wore simple clothes, the boys in overalls and white shirts, the girls in plain dresses that belonged to another century. But their eyes were old, ancient, like they'd seen things that would break an adult's mind. The oldest boy stepped forward, and I could see he was maybe 19, with the kind of pale, serious face you'd expect to see in an old daguerreotype. He raised his hand in greeting, but there was something wrong with the gesture. Too formal, too practiced, like he'd done it many times before. I rolled down my window, trying to seem friendly despite the ice in my veins. The boy approached my car with measured steps, his bare feet silent on the cracked asphalt. Up close, I could see that his eyes were the color of corn silk, almost white in the afternoon sun. He placed his hand on my car door, his fingers long and thin like corn stalks themselves. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone much older, someone who'd been making life and death decisions since childhood. He told me that Gatlin was a blessed place, chosen by He who walks behind the rows to be purified. That the adults had grown corrupt and selfish, worshipping false gods like money and progress instead of the sacred corn. That children were pure, innocent, close to the earth and its ancient wisdom. He explained that when a child reached their 19th birthday in Gatlin, they were given a choice. Join the adults in their corruption and face the judgment of the corn, or sacrifice themselves willingly to ensure another year of fertile harvest. Most chose sacrifice. It was an honor to feed the land that fed them. But some adults refused to understand. They tried to leave, to escape their destiny. That is why the children had to take matters into their own hands. The man I found in the corn had been trying to run away on his 40th birthday. The same age I just turned that very morning. As the boy spoke, the other children began to emerge from the corn all around me. They moved with perfect coordination, like a school of fish or a flock of birds. Some carried farming tools, sickles, pruning shears, corn knives sharpened to razor edges. Others held homemade weapons, sharpened sticks, rocks wrapped in cloth, lengths of rope. But what terrified me most were their faces. No anger, no hatred, no emotion at all. Just the calm certainty of children who believed absolutely in what they were doing. To them, this wasn't murder. This was farming. I gunned the engine and tore out of there, spraying gravel and dust as I fought to get back to the highway. But every road I took led back to corn. Every turn brought me deeper into the maze of stalks that seemed to shift and move when I wasn't looking directly at them. The sun was setting, painting the cornfields blood red, when I finally accepted the truth. There was no way out. The corn wouldn't let me leave. Not until I served my purpose. I found myself back in Gatlin as darkness fell, my gas tank empty, my phone still showing no signal. The children were waiting for me in the town square, arranged in a perfect circle around an old church that I hadn't noticed before. They held candles that flickered in the evening breeze, casting dancing shadows across their young faces. The pale boy stepped forward again, his corn silk eyes reflecting the candlelight like mirrors. He explained that I was blessed to arrive on such an auspicious day. My birthday, combined with the harvest moon rising over the corn, made this a perfect night for sacrifice. They led me into the church, which was decorated with corn husks and dried stalks arranged in elaborate patterns. The altar had been carved from a single massive corn cob, its surface stained dark with years of offerings. Candles burned in holders made from hollowed corn cobs, filling the air with the sweet smell of burning kernels. The children took their places in the pews, their faces solemn and reverent. The pale boy produced an ancient leather-bound book, its pages yellow with age. He began to read in a language that sounded like wind through corn stalks, words that seemed to make the shadows dance and writhe. As he read, I felt something changing in the air around me. The walls of the church seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting like living tissue. The corn decorations began to rustle and move, even though there was no wind inside the building. And then I heard it, a sound like footsteps, but wrong somehow. Too heavy, too slow, too deliberate. Something was walking through the corn outside, circling the church, getting closer with each pass. The children, his faces lit up with joy and terror in equal measure. Their savior had come. He who walks behind the rows was answering their call. The footsteps stopped directly outside the church door. In the silence that followed, I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. Then came a sound like corn stalks being crushed underfoot, like massive weight pressing down on the earth itself. The church door began to creak open, inch by inch, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. But the darkness was wrong, too thick, too alive. It moved like liquid shadow, pouring into the church like smoke. And in that darkness, I saw eyes. Not human eyes, but something older and hungrier. Eyes that had watched civilizations rise and fall, had seen the first seeds planted in virgin soil, had witnessed every harvest and every sacrifice made in the name of fertility and growth. The pale boy closed his book and smiled, his corn silk eyes now glowing with an inner light. He explained that I should feel honored. My death would feed the corn for decades to come. My blood would ensure another generation of perfect harvests. My bones would enrich the soil and make the children strong. But as he spoke, I noticed something the children had missed in their religious fervor. The thing in the doorway wasn't just hungry for my blood. It was hungry for all blood. Its ancient eyes were fixed not just on me, but on every person in the church. The pale boy was 19 years old. His time was up too. As understanding dawned on his face, the thing that walked behind the rows stepped fully into the church. It wasn't the human, had never been human. It was something made of corn and shadow and the dark spaces between growing things. Something that had been fed by generations of children who thought they were serving a benevolent god of agriculture. But there are no benevolent gods in the corn. Only hunger that grows with every feeding. The children screamed as they finally understood the truth. They'd been raising something that saw them not as worshippers, but as livestock. Something that had patiently waited for them to call their own parents and grandparents before it claimed its real prize. In the chaos that followed, I ran through the cornfields in absolute darkness, guided only by starlight and the desperate need to escape. Behind me, I could hear the children crying out as they learned too late that some harvests claim everyone. I found the highway as the sun rose, flagged down a trucker who gave me a ride to the next town. When I told the local sheriff about Gatlin, he just shook his head and said that place had been abandoned for 20 years. Said the corn blight got so bad they had to burn the whole area and relocate everyone. But I know better. I know that somewhere in the Nebraska corn belt, there is still a town where children rule and adults disappear. Where something ancient and hungry walks between the rows, waiting patiently for the next harvest. And I know that every year, when the corn is high and the harvest moon rises, it gets a little stronger, a little hungrier, a little closer to walking out of those fields and into the world beyond. The trucker who picked me up mentioned something strange as we drove away. Said the corn around Gatlin always grows taller than anywhere else. Said sometimes, on quiet nights, you can hear children singing hymns in the wind. I didn't tell him that those aren't the hymns they re-singing. They read dinner bells. Don't forget, subscribe now, so the next story finds you before it finds someone else. And while you're here, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from. Your small town might have whispers of its own. Story 5. Publisher, it's cursed something was crawling under my skin. And it started the moment I touched the headstone of the man who published the first authenticated account of the Bell Witch. By the time I left Greenwood Cemetery in Tennessee, invisible insects were burrowing through my flesh, and I knew I had awakened something that should have stayed buried. My name is Paul, and I research American folklore for a podcast about unexplained phenomena. The Bell Witch case from the early 1800s is one of the most documented supernatural events in American history, so when I learned about Martin Van Buren Ingram's grave, I had to investigate. He was the publisher who first brought the Bell Witch story to the world, and according to local legend, he paid a terrible price for that decision. Greenwood Cemetery sits on a hill outside Adams, Tennessee, its weathered headstones scattered among oak trees that have stood for over a century. Most of the graves date back to the 1800s, including several members of the Bell family who were tormented by the supernatural entity that made their name famous across America. But it was Ingram's grave that drew me to this quiet cemetery on a gray October afternoon. Martin Ingram had been a respected publisher in Nashville when he decided to investigate the Bell Witch legend in the 1890s. He interviewed survivors, collected testimonies, and compiled the first comprehensive account of the haunting that had terrorized the Bell family decades earlier. But from the moment his printing presses began working on the book, strange things started happening. The type would rearrange itself overnight, turning coherent sentences into gibberish or threats. Printing plates would crack for no reason, ruining entire runs of pages. Workers reported feeling watched while they worked, and several quit after experiencing what they described as phantom touches and whispered warnings. Ingram pushed forward despite the interference, determined to bring the Bell Witch story to the public. The book was eventually published, but the supernatural harassment did not stop. According to his family, Ingram spent his final years plagued by the sensation of invisible creatures crawling across his skin, a torment that followed him to his grave in 1914. His headstone was simple granite, worn smooth by decades of Tennessee weather. But as I knelt beside it to take photographs for my research, I felt something that made my skin crawl in the most literal sense possible. It started as a tickling sensation on my left arm, like a spider walking across my skin. I brushed at the spot reflexively, but there was nothing there. The feeling persisted, then spread, moving up my arm with the deliberate progress of something alive and purposeful. I assumed it was just my imagination, influenced by the stories I had read about Ingram's torment. But as I continued photographing the grave and taking notes, the crawling sensation grew stronger and more widespread. By the time I finished my work at the cemetery, it felt like dozens of invisible insects were moving across my body. The sensation was so realistic that I kept checking my clothes and skin, expecting to find beetles or ants or spiders. But there was never anything there, just the persistent feeling of tiny legs and bodies moving against my flesh. The drive back to my hotel in Nashville was torture. Every few minutes, I had to pull over and check myself again, convinced that something was actually crawling on me. But my skin was clear, unmarked, showing no sign of the invasion I could feel so clearly. That night in my hotel room, the sensations intensified. It was no longer just a tickling feeling, but something more invasive. I could feel things moving under my skin, burrowing through my flesh like parasites seeking deeper tissues. The sensation was so real, so physically present, that I spent hours in the bathroom examining myself under bright lights, looking for any sign of the creatures I was certain were inside me. I took photos of my skin with my phone, zooming in on every pore and hair follicle, searching for evidence of entry wounds or movement beneath the surface. But the pictures showed nothing except normal human skin, slightly reddened from my constant scratching and prodding. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel them more clearly. Tiny bodies writhing through my muscles, following my circulatory system, exploring my internal organs with a purpose I could not understand. I spent the night pacing my hotel room, clawing at my skin, trying to dig out invaders that existed only in my perception. By morning, I was desperate for answers. I drove back to Adams and found the local historical society, hoping someone could explain what I was experiencing. The elderly woman who ran the place took one look at me and nodded knowingly. She had seen this before, she said. Other researchers, other visitors to Ingram's grave who had been touched by whatever force still haunted the publisher's remains. Most people experienced it for a few days and then it faded. But some, she warned, were not so lucky. She told me about a paranormal investigator from California who had visited the grave 5 years earlier. He had reported the same crawling sensations, the same feeling of invisible parasites under his skin. But in his case, the torment had never stopped. He had returned to California and spent months seeing doctors, undergoing tests, trying to find a physical cause for what he was experiencing. The medical examinations found nothing wrong with him. No parasites, no skin conditions, no neurological disorders that could explain his symptoms. But the crawling sensations grew worse over time, driving him to increasingly desperate measures to find relief. He had eventually been found dead in his apartment, his body covered in self-inflicted wounds where he had tried to dig out the creatures he believed were living inside him. The coroner ruled it suicide, But those who knew his story understood that he had been killed by something far more sinister than mental illness. The woman at the Historical Society gave me a piece of advice that chilled me to the bone. She told me to stay away from anything related to the Bell Witch, to stop my research immediately, and to pray that whatever had attached itself to me would lose interest if I no longer posed a threat to its secrets. But I was a researcher, and researchers do not abandon projects because of superstitious warnings. I decided to dig deeper into Ingram's story, convinced that understanding the source of the haunting would help me find a way to end it. That decision nearly cost me my life. The crawling sensations grew exponentially worse over the following weeks. What had started as a minor annoyance became a constant torment that dominated every moment of my existence. I could feel them everywhere now, not just under my skin but inside my organs, moving through my digestive system, exploring my brain tissue. I stopped eating because I could feel them in my stomach, writhing through partially digested food. I stopped sleeping because they were most active in the dark, when I had no distractions from their movements. I lost 30 pounds in a month and developed a facial tic from constantly scratching at imaginary parasites. My research revealed the true horror of what Martin Ingram had unleashed with his book. The Bell Witch had not been a simple poltergeist or restless spirit. According to the most detailed accounts, it was something far older and more malevolent, a force that fed on human suffering and grew stronger with each person it tormented. Ingram's book had not just documented the haunting, it had provided the entity with a new vector for spreading its influence. Every person who read the authenticated history became a potential host for the Bell Witch, his power. Most readers experienced nothing more than nightmares or brief feelings of unease. But some, those who delved too deeply into the story or visited places connected to the haunting, became conduits for the entity, this hunger. I was one of those conduits, and the crawling sensations were just the beginning of my transformation. The Bell Witch was using me to spread its influence, turning my body into a breeding ground for supernatural parasites that existed in the space between physical and spiritual reality. These creatures were not visible to cameras or detectable by medical equipment because they inhabited a dimension slightly removed from our own. But they were real enough to drive their hosts to madness and death. As my condition worsened, I began to understand what had driven that investigator from California to claw his own skin apart. The sensation of things living inside you, feeding on your life force, reproducing in your flesh, becomes unbearable after weeks of constant torment. I found myself scratching until I bled, digging at my skin with fingernails and improvised tools, trying to reach the creatures I knew were there. The rational part of my mind understood that I was hurting myself, but the crawling sensations were so intense that physical pain became preferable to the psychological torment. That is when I discovered the only way to stop the Bell Witch, this curse. Hidden in Ingram's personal papers, which I finally tracked down in a private collection, was a letter describing his final attempt to break free from the supernatural torment. He had returned to the Bell Farm in Adams, to the place where the haunting had originally occurred, and performed a ritual of submission and apology. The Bell Witch, according to Ingram's letter, had accepted his surrender and withdrawn its parasites in exchange for a promise. He would never again speak or write about the haunting, and he would take the true details of the entity's nature to his grave. Ingram had kept his promise, dying in 1914 without revealing what he had learned about the Bell Witch, his true identity. But his letter provided enough details for me to attempt the same ritual of submission. I drove back to Adams, Tennessee, my skin crawling with invisible invaders, my sanity hanging by a thread. The Bell Farm was now private property, but I snuck onto the land in the middle of the night and found the spot where the family's cabin had once stood. Following Ingram's instructions, I knelt on the cold ground and spoke directly to the Bell Witch, acknowledging its power and begging for release from its curse. I promised to abandon my research, to destroy my notes, to never again investigate the haunting that had made the Bell name infamous. The response was immediate and terrifying. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in seconds, and I could hear something moving through the trees around me. Not footsteps, but a sliding, serpentine sound like massive coils of muscle dragging across dead leaves. The Bell Witch was manifesting physically, showing me just a fraction of its true power. Then it spoke, not with a voice I could hear, but directly into my mind with words that burned like acid through my consciousness. The dead is acknowledged, it said. The parasites are withdrawn, but the mark remains. You will remember this night for the rest of your life, and you will know that I'm always watching. The crawling sensation stopped instantly, as if someone had flipped a switch in my nervous system. For the first time in weeks, my skin felt normal, free from the invisible invaders that had been tormenting me. But the relief came with a price that I am still paying. The Bell Witch kept its word and released me from the crawling curse, but it left something else in place of the parasites. A connection, a link between my mind and its ancient intelligence that allows it to observe the world through my eyes. I can feel it sometimes, especially in quiet moments when my guard is down. A presence in the back of my mind, cold and patient and eternally hungry. It watches through me, learns about the modern world through my experiences, and occasionally whispers suggestions that I struggle to resist. I destroyed my research as promised and never published the podcast episode about the Bell Witch. But I am telling this story now because I believe others need to understand the danger of investigating certain American legends too deeply. The Bell Witch is not just a historical curiosity or folklore to be studied. It is a living entity that continues to hunt for new victims, new hosts to carry its influence into the world. Martin Ingram learned that lesson the hard way, and so did I. If you ever find yourself in Tennessee, if you ever visit Greenwood Cemetery and see that simple granite headstone marking Martin Ingram, his grave, do not touch it. Do not linger there. Do not let curiosity overcome caution. Because some stories are not meant to be researched. Some graves are not meant to be disturbed. And some curses are not meant to be awakened. The crawling has stopped, but the watching never will. I am marked now, forever connected to something that should have been left alone in its Tennessee grave. And every day, I feel it growing stronger. Story 6. Watchers of Manly. They knew exactly what time I'd eaten lunch, how many cigarettes I smoked, and the precise moment I realized something was wrong with the GPS coordinates. I was a utility inspector for the state of Louisiana, sent to evaluate power line infrastructure in remote rural areas. Manly was supposed to be a routine assignment, just another dot on the map that needed documentation for federal compliance reports. What I found instead was a town that shouldn't exist, populated by people who had been watching me long before I knew they were there. The first sign of trouble came when my GPS started showing roads that weren't on any official state highway map. County Road 247 appeared on my navigation system as a main thoroughfare, but according to my paper maps, it should have been empty swampland. When I tried to cross-reference the coordinates with satellite imagery on my phone, the area showed up as nothing but dense forest and wetlands. But the road was real. I was driving on it. The pavement was old but well-maintained, bordered by drainage ditches that ran perfectly straight for miles in either direction. Power lines followed the road exactly as my work orders indicated, but the poles were wooden relics that looked like they'd been installed decades ago. Most utility companies had switched to concrete or steel by now, especially in Louisiana where hurricanes made wooden poles a liability. These poles showed no signs of weather damage, no rot, no insect infestation, no evidence of the storms that routinely battered this part of the state. They looked almost preserved, like museum pieces that had been frozen in time. The houses started appearing around noon. Small, single-story homes set back from the road, each one surrounded by a chain-link fence and a yard that was maintained with mathematical precision. The grass was cut to exactly the same height at every property. The paint jobs were uniform shades of white and beige. Even the mailboxes were identical, positioned at precisely the same distance from the road. But every house was empty. I stopped at 6 different properties to check for electrical meters and service connections. Each time, I knocked on the front door and waited for a response that never came. The windows were covered with Venetian blinds that were closed at identical angles. No cars in the driveways, no signs of recent occupation, but the lawns were freshly mowed and the utilities were clearly active. Someone was maintaining these properties, but whoever they were, they didn't want to be seen. The first time I noticed the truck, I assumed it was another utility worker. A white pickup had been following the same route I was taking, staying about a quarter mile behind me as I moved from house to house. When I waved from my truck, the driver didn't respond, but the vehicle continued to mirror my movements with mechanical precision. By the third house, I realized the truck was always positioned where the driver could observe everything I was doing. I tried to get a closer look by doubling back on my route, but the white pickup disappeared whenever I changed direction. It would reappear minutes later in a different location, always at the perfect distance to maintain visual contact without getting close enough for me to see the driver clearly. That is when I started documenting everything with my phone. The photos I took that day show something that defies logical explanation. Wide shots of the empty houses revealed nothing unusual, but when I zoomed in on individual windows, I could see shapes moving behind the closed blinds. Shadows that shifted position between frames, suggesting someone was inside each supposedly abandoned building. More disturbing were the pictures that showed details I hadn't noticed while taking them. In several shots, I could make out faces in the background, partially concealed behind trees or utility poles. Always at the edge of the frame, always just blurry enough to avoid clear identification, but unmistakably human. The same faces appeared in multiple locations along my route, which should have been impossible unless they were somehow moving faster than I was. The realization that I was being systematically tracked by multiple people hit me around 2 in the afternoon. I had stopped to inspect a transformer that wasn't showing on my equipment list, trying to figure out why there was electrical infrastructure in a location that didn't officially exist. While I was working, I noticed movement in my peripheral vision and turned to see a man standing at the edge of the tree line about 50 yards away. He was wearing work clothes and a baseball cap, standing completely motionless with his arms at his sides. When I looked directly at him, he didn't move or acknowledge my presence. He just stood there, watching me with the patient intensity of someone who had all the time in the world. I finished my inspection quickly and got back in my truck, but the man remained in position until I drove away. In my rearview mirror, I could see him pull out a cell phone and make a brief call before disappearing back into the trees. That's when I understood I wasn't just being watched. I was being coordinated. Over the next hour, the surveillance became more obvious and more unsettling. People appeared at regular intervals along my route, always positioned where they could observe my activities from a distance. They never approached or tried to interact, but their presence was impossible to ignore. A woman standing beside a mailbox, pretending to check for mail while keeping her eyes fixed on my truck. A man working in his yard who stopped all activity whenever I drove past. Children playing in front yards who froze in place until I was out of sight. The most disturbing part was their timing. No matter how I varied my speed or changed my route, there was always someone waiting for me at the next location. They were predicting my movements, staying one step ahead of me despite having no apparent way to communicate my position to each other. By 4 o'clock, I had counted at least 20 different individuals involved in tracking my progress through Manly. I decided to test their coordination by making an unexpected stop at a house that wasn't on my inspection list. I pulled into the driveway of a property that looked identical to all the others, grabbed my clipboard to make the stop look official, and walked to the front door. Before I could knock, the door opened. The man who answered was probably in his 60s, wearing clean work clothes and a friendly expression that didn't quite reach his eyes. He acted like he'd been expecting me, inviting me inside for coffee and asking about my work with the casual familiarity of someone who had known me for years. But he knew too much about my day. He mentioned the transformer I inspected, describing its location and condition with perfect accuracy despite having no apparent way to know I'd been there. He asked if I'd gotten good pictures of the houses on County Road 247, referencing specific properties by details that weren't visible from the road. Most unnerving of all, he knew about my lunch break. I had stopped at a gas station 20 miles outside Manly to buy a sandwich and cigarettes. It was a brief stop at a location that had nothing to do with my work assignment. But this stranger knew exactly what I'd eaten, how long I'd stayed, and even mentioned the magazine I'd flipped through while waiting to pay. When I asked how he could possibly know these details, his friendly expression never changed, but something shifted behind his eyes. He told me that he and his friends had been keeping track of my movements all day. Not just in Manly, but from the moment I left my hotel that morning. They knew my name, my job title, my home address in Baton Rouge. They knew I was divorced, that I lived alone, that I rarely talked to my coworkers outside of required business. They had been studying me long before I arrived in Manly. The man explained that their community had developed certain protocols for dealing with outside visitors. Government workers, in particular, required careful monitoring to ensure they didn't cause problems for the town. This unique situation. When I asked what he meant by unique situation, he walked to the window and pointed toward the houses I'd been inspecting. Every single building was occupied now. People stood in their front yards, on their porches, behind their windows, all facing toward the house where I was sitting. Men, women, children, elderly residents, at least 100 people who had emerged from buildings that had appeared completely empty just hours earlier. They were all watching me. The man explained that Manly existed in what he called a transitional state. The town was real, but it existed slightly outside normal geographical and temporal boundaries. People who lived there could choose when to be visible to outsiders, when to interact with the regular world, and when to retreat into their protected existence. Most visitors never saw the true Manly. They drove through empty roads, documented abandoned infrastructure, and left without ever knowing they had been observed by an entire community that existed just beyond their perception. But sometimes, a visitor would linger too long or ask too many questions or take too many pictures. When that happened, the community would reveal itself just enough to send a message. I was being warned. The man walked me back to my truck, maintaining his friendly demeanor while making it clear that my inspection was complete. He suggested I file my report based on what I'd already documented and recommended against returning to the area for follow-up visits. As I drove away from Manly, I could see people lining the roads, standing motionless beside their mailboxes and in their driveways. They watched my truck pass with expressions that conveyed both threat and patience, as if they were memorizing my face for future reference. In my rearview mirror, I could see the white pickup truck that had been following me all day. This time, the driver was visible through the windshield, and I recognized him as the man who had invited me into his house. He followed me all the way to the parish line before disappearing down a side road that wasn't on any of my maps. I filed my report the next day, documenting the electrical infrastructure I found but making no mention of the community that surrounded it. Official records show that the area around Manly contains only abandoned farmland and isolated utility stations. According to every database I can access, no town by that name exists in Louisiana. But I kept the photos I took that day, and I study them regularly. Each time I look at them, I notice new details that weren't visible before. More faces in the background, more evidence of the coordinated surveillance I experienced. The most disturbing photo was taken accidentally while I was getting back into my truck at the last house I visited. It shows my reflection in the driver's side window, but also captures something else. Behind me, barely visible in the shadows, stands a group of at least a dozen people. They repositioned in a perfect semicircle, close enough to touch me, all facing toward my truck with expressions of intense concentration. I had no idea they were there when the photo was taken. 3 months later, I received a package at my home in Baton Rouge. No return address, no postmark, no indication of how it had been delivered. Inside was a single photograph showing my apartment building from across the street, taken from the exact angle of my bedroom window. At the bottom of the photo, someone had written a message in careful handwriting. "We hope you filed an accurate report. I'll be checking. They've since requested transfers to other regions, but my supervisor keeps assigning me to rural inspection routes in parishes that border the area where Manly is located. Each assignment takes me a little closer to that stretch of road where I encountered something that shouldn't exist. Last week, I noticed a white pickup truck in my apartment complex parking lot. The driver was gone by the time I got downstairs, but the vehicle had Louisiana plates and a utility company decal that matched the one I'd seen in Manly. They were still watching me, still keeping track of my movements, still making sure I understand the consequences of asking too many questions about places that prefer to remain invisible. The watchers of Manly aren't confined to their impossible town. They can project their influence anywhere they choose, follow anyone who has seen too much, maintain surveillance on people who might pose a threat to their protected existence. I think about that transitional state the man described, about communities that exist just outside normal boundaries. How many other places like Manly are hidden throughout Louisiana? How many utility workers, surveyors, and government inspectors have encountered them without realizing what they found? And how many of those people are being watched right now, tracked by communities that exist in the spaces between the official maps, populated by watchers who never stop observing and never forget a face? I don't drive through rural Louisiana anymore without checking my rearview mirror constantly. Because somewhere out there, the watchers of Manly are still keeping track of my every movement, and they were always exactly where they need to be. Story 7. Sundown Terror. The warning came from a gas station attendant in Carbondale, 20 miles north of Anna, Illinois. He looked at my map, shook his head, and told me I didn't want to be driving through that town after dark. I was a traveling insurance investigator, working a case involving a suspicious house fire that had killed 3 people in Anna 6 months earlier. The local police had ruled it an accident, but the insurance company wasn't too satisfied with the inconsistencies in the reports. They sent me to conduct interviews and gather additional evidence for what should have been a routine fraud investigation. What I discovered instead was a town where fear had calcified into tradition, where historical hatred had evolved into something far more dangerous than simple prejudice. The attendant explained that Anna had once been what locals called a sundown town, a place where certain people weren't too safe after the sun went down. The old signs were long gone, but the attitudes they represented had never really disappeared. They'd just gone underground, become more subtle, more organized. I assumed he was talking about lingering racism in a small southern Illinois town, the kind of backward thinking you might expect in rural communities that hadn't changed much since the 1950s. I thanked him for the warning and told him to be careful. I had no idea what careful really meant in Anna. The town looked normal enough when I arrived at noon on a Tuesday in October. Main Street had the usual collection of small businesses, a courthouse, a few churches, and residential neighborhoods that sprawled out toward the farmland that surrounded the community. The people I encountered were polite, if reserved, and several of them offered to help when they learned I was investigating the house fire. But I noticed things that seemed odd for a town of less than 5,000 people. There were security cameras everywhere, not just on businesses, but on residential streets, positioned at intersections and mounted on utility poles throughout the community. Far more surveillance than you expect in a place where everybody supposedly knew everybody else. More disturbing were the patrol schedules. Anna had a police force of 6 officers for a population that should have required maybe 2 or 3. But I counted police cars making regular rounds through every neighborhood, sometimes passing the same locations multiple times per hour. It wasn't random patrolling. It was systematic monitoring, like they were watching for something specific. The house fire I was investigating had occurred on Oak Street, in a mixed neighborhood where the victims had been among the few black families in Anna. The official report blamed faulty electrical wiring, but when I examined the scene, I found evidence that suggested a very different story. Scorch patterns on the exterior walls indicated the fire had started in multiple locations simultaneously. Window glass had been broken from the outside before the flames spread. Most telling were the tire tracks in the soft ground beside the house, tracks from at least 3 different vehicles that had been present during the fire. Someone had deliberately trapped the Williams family in their burning home. I started interviewing neighbors, but the responses I received were eerily consistent. Everyone had been asleep when the fire started. Nobody had seen any unusual activity. The family had kept to themselves, hadn't caused any problems, but maybe they'd just been unlucky. The uniformity of these responses suggested coordination, like the entire neighborhood had agreed on a single version of events that bore no resemblance to reality. That evening, I decided to conduct some additional surveillance of the Oak Street area, hoping to get a better sense of the neighborhood dynamics and maybe find a witness who hadn't been interviewed by the police. That's when I learned what the security cameras were really for. At exactly 6:30, as the sun was setting behind the farmland west of town, every police car in Anna began moving toward the residential areas. Not patrolling randomly, but taking predetermined positions that created a grid pattern throughout the community. I watched from my rental car as officers positioned themselves at strategic intersections, creating what looked like a perimeter around the entire town. Their patrol cars were equipped with powerful spotlights that could illuminate several blocks in any direction. At 7 o'clock, the spotlights came on. The entire town was bathed in harsh white light, every street and alley visible from multiple angles. The effect was like being inside a prison yard during a lockdown, except this was a normal Tuesday evening in small-town Illinois. I tried to drive through one of the residential neighborhoods to get a closer look at this operation, but I was pulled over within 2 blocks of leaving my parking spot. The officer who approached my car was polite but firm. He explained that there were safety concerns in the area after dark, and it would be better if I returned to my motel for the evening. When I asked what kind of safety concerns, he mentioned recent reports of suspicious individuals who might be dangerous to residents and visitors alike. He recommended I complete my business in Anna during daylight hours and avoid driving through town after sunset. Back at my motel, I started researching Anna's history as a sundown town. What I found was worse than I expected. Anna hadn't just been informally hostile to black residents. From the 1920s through the 1960s, the town had enforced its racial policies through organized violence and intimidation. Cross burnings, house fires, and beatings were documented methods used to ensure compliance with the community's unofficial segregation policies. But the most disturbing information came from more recent sources. According to civil rights organizations, Anna's reputation as a place to avoid after dark had persisted long after the civil rights era. As recently as the 2000s, there were reports of black motorists being followed, harassed, and threatened when passing through the town. Several incidents had involved organized groups of local residents working in coordination with law enforcement. The Williams family fire wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern that stretched back decades. The next morning, I decided to interview some of the older residents who might remember the town's segregated past. I started with a barbershop on Main Street, figuring that longtime customers might be willing to share stories about Anna's history. The barber, a man in his 70s named Frank, was initially reluctant to discuss the town's racial history. But when I mentioned the Williams family fire, his demeanor changed completely. He told me the fire had been a tragedy, but also a warning. Anna had worked hard to maintain its character over the years, and sometimes that required difficult decisions. The Williams family had been good people, but their presence had attracted attention from outside agitators who wanted to change the town's traditional way of life. When I asked what he meant by outside agitators, Frank explained that civil rights groups had been using Anna as a test case for challenging sundown town policies. They had been encouraging black families to move to Anna, to file discrimination complaints, and to document incidents of harassment for use in federal lawsuits. The Williams family they'd just been residents. They had been part of a deliberate campaign to force change on a community that didn't want to change. According to Frank, the house fire had been a message to other potential troublemakers. A demonstration that Anna's residents were serious about protecting their way of life, regardless of what outsiders might think about their methods. He suggested I be careful about the questions I was asking and the conclusions I was drawing. People in Anna didn't like being judged by outsiders who didn't understand the community's history and values. That afternoon, I noticed I was being followed. A pickup truck had been behind me since I left the barbershop, maintaining a careful distance but mirroring every turn I made through town. When I stopped at a restaurant for lunch, the truck parked across the street. When I visited the courthouse to review fire department records, it appeared in the courthouse parking lot. The driver was a young man wearing a baseball cap and sunglasses, and he made no effort to hide the fact that he was monitoring my movements. When our eyes met across the courthouse steps, he nodded politely and touched the brim of his cap, as if we were old acquaintances acknowledging each other. I was being warned again, more directly this time. That evening, I decided to test the limits of Anna's enforcement policies. Instead of returning to my motel before sunset, I parked on Oak Street near the site of the Williams house fire and waited to see what would happen. The response was immediate and overwhelming. By 6:45, 3 police cars had taken positions at both ends of the block. The spotlights came on as scheduled, but this time they were all focused on my rental car. I was surrounded by harsh white light that made it impossible to see anything beyond the immediate area around my vehicle. Then the other cars arrived. Pickup trucks began appearing from side streets and driveways, forming a loose circle around my position. I counted at least a dozen vehicles, all with their headlights pointing toward me, creating a wall of light that was blinding even with my windows closed. The occupants of these vehicles didn't get out or approach my car. They just sat there, engines running, maintaining their positions like they were executing a well-rehearsed plan. I understood that I was being contained. My cell phone had no signal, which should have been impossible in a small town with adequate cell tower coverage. Someone was jamming communications, preventing me from calling for help or documenting what was happening. After 20 minutes of this standoff, one of the police officers walked over to my car and tapped on the driver's side window. He was calm and professional, but his message was unmistakable. I needed to leave Anna immediately. Not just for the evening, but permanently. My investigation was complete, and my continued presence in town was creating public safety concerns that local law enforcement couldn't ignore. When I asked about my right to conduct legitimate business in Anna, he explained that certain constitutional protections didn't apply in communities that were exercising their traditional authority to maintain local order. He gave me a business card with a phone number where I could file a formal complaint if I disagreed with the town's policies. The card was blank except for the number. I drove straight back to my motel, packed my bags, and left Anna that night. But not before I understood the true horror of what I encountered. Anna hadn't abandoned its sundown town policies. It had evolved them, The systematic surveillance, the coordinated response teams, the communication jamming, the legal intimidation. All of it was designed to maintain the town's racial exclusion policies while avoiding the kind of overt violence that might attract federal attention. Modern technology had made it possible to create an atmosphere of fear and control that was far more effective than the cross-burnings and lynchings of previous generations. Why resort to crude violence when you could achieve the same results through sophisticated intimidation? The Williams family fire had been a demonstration, a show of force designed to discourage other black families from attempting to establish themselves in Anna. But it had also been a test of the community's new methods, a way of measuring how effectively they could coordinate a violent response while maintaining plausible deniability. My insurance investigation had stumbled into something much larger than a simple arson case. I had discovered a community that had successfully weaponized modern surveillance and coordination techniques to maintain policies that should have been abolished 50 years ago. Back in Chicago, I submitted my report to the insurance company, documenting the evidence of arson and recommending that they pay the Williams family's claim in full. But I also contacted the FBI's Civil Rights Division and provided them with everything I had learned about Anna's enforcement methods. 3 months later, a federal task force raided several properties in Anna and arrested 12 people on charges related to conspiracy, civil rights violations, and the Williams family murders. The investigation revealed a network of similar communities throughout southern Illinois, all using comparable methods to maintain racial exclusion policies. But the prosecutions were difficult, and most of the defendants received relatively light sentences. The coordination had been so sophisticated, the plausible deniability so complete, that proving criminal intent was nearly impossible. Anna is still there, still maintaining its traditional character, still finding ways to discourage the wrong kind of people from staying too long. The surveillance cameras are still operating, the patrol schedules are still in effect, and the spotlights still come on every evening at 7 o'clock. The only difference now is that they are more careful about who they target and how they respond to outside scrutiny. They received several phone calls over the past year from people who claim to be residents of Anna. They are always polite, always professional, but the message is always the same. My investigation caused problems for their community, and they want me to know they haven't forgotten about the trouble I created. They have my address, my phone number, my work schedule. They know where I live, where I shop, where I take my car for maintenance. Just like the Williams family, they become a person of interest to a community that doesn't like being challenged by outsiders. The Sundown Terror of Anna, Illinois isn't a relic from the past. It's a living system that has adapted to modern times, using technology and coordination to maintain policies that most Americans thought had been defeated decades ago. And it is spreading to other communities that want to preserve their traditional way of life, regardless of what the law or basic human decency might require. The sun still sets every day in Anna, and when it does, the spotlights come on and the patrol cars take their positions. The town is still enforcing its unofficial motto, still making sure that certain people understand they are not welcome after dark. Some traditions never die. They just learn to hide better. Story 8. Melon Heads. I should have turned around the moment I saw those scratches on my car door. Deep gouges in the metal, like fingernails dragging across steel. But I was already 2 hours into the Ohio backwoods, and my GPS had died somewhere near Kirtland. All I wanted was to find a way back to the interstate. My name is Rick, and I work construction in Cleveland. I had been driving home from a job site in Pennsylvania when I took what I thought was a shortcut through the rural counties east of the city. That shortcut became the worst mistake of my life. The scratches appeared after I stopped at a gas station that looked like it had been abandoned since the 80s. Rust-stained pumps, windows covered in yellowed newspaper, weeds growing through cracks in the concrete. But the sign said open, and I needed directions. The old man behind the counter had milky eyes that never quite focused on me. When I asked about getting back to Route 90, he just stared for a long moment, then pointed toward a narrow road that disappeared into thick forest. "Stay on the main road," he whispered. "Do not stop. Do not get out of your car. And whatever you do, do not drive at night." I thought he was just another crazy old-timer trying to spook the city boy. But as I walked back to my truck, I found those scratches carved deep into the driver's side door. Fresh scratches. The metal was still warm to the touch. The forest road was narrower than I expected, barely wide enough for my pickup. Dense trees pressed in from both sides, their branches forming a canopy so thick that even in late afternoon, the world turned gray and shadowy. My headlights cut through the gloom, but they seemed weaker somehow, as if the darkness was pushing back. That is when I started hearing the sounds. At first, just scratching, like the sound that had been made on my truck door, but coming from the trees around me. Rhythmic scraping, moving parallel to my vehicle as I drove deeper into the woods. I rolled down my window to listen better, and immediately regretted it. The scratching was not random. It had pattern, almost like communication, and underneath it, I heard something else. Breathing, heavy, labored breathing from multiple sources, keeping pace with my truck. I pressed harder on the gas pedal, but the narrow road forced me to keep a careful speed. The scratching sounds multiplied, joined by what sounded like footsteps, but not normal footsteps. These had a strange rhythm, like something walking on legs that did not quite work right. Then I saw the first one. It was crouched beside a fallen log about 20 feet from the road, and my headlights caught it for just a moment before it scrambled back into the shadows. But that moment was enough to freeze my blood. The thing looked human, but wrong. Its head was too large, bulging and misshapen, sitting on a thin neck that seemed barely able to support it. Its limbs were twisted, bent at angles that made my stomach turn. And its skin was pale, almost white, stretched tight over bones that jutted out like broken sticks. I had heard the stories, of course. Every kid in northern Ohio grows up hearing whispers about the Melon Heads. Local legend claimed they were the victims of some twisted doctor who had performed experiments on children decades ago. The survivors had escaped into the woods, growing feral and deformed, living like animals in the deep forest. Most people laughed at the stories, called them urban legends, campfire tales meant to scare teenagers. But as I drove deeper into those woods, with more and more of those things moving through the trees around me, I realized the stories were not legends at all. They were warnings. The road began to curve, winding deeper into the forest, and I noticed something that made my hands shake on the steering wheel. The scratching sounds were getting closer, and they were coming from above now, as well as from the sides. I looked up through my windshield and saw shapes moving through the tree branches. Thin, pale figures swinging from branch to branch like some nightmare version of monkeys, keeping pace with my truck. Their oversized heads bobbed and weaved as they moved, and I could see their eyes reflecting my headlights like an animal. The road narrowed even more, forcing me to slow down. The creatures grew bolder, dropping to lower branches, some of them hanging just feet above my truck. I could hear their breathing clearly now, and something else, a sound that was almost like laughing, but distorted, broken. That is when my engine started to sputter. The truck coughed, jerked, and began to lose power. I pressed the gas pedal to the floor, but the engine was dying. Steam rose from under the hood, and I smelled the acrid scent of overheated metal. "No," I whispered, pumping the gas pedal desperately. "Not here, not now." But the truck rolled to a stop in the middle of that narrow forest road, surrounded by darkness and the sound of things moving in the trees. The engine ticked as it cooled, and then there was silence. Complete, absolute silence that felt like a held breath. I sat in my dead truck, hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to think. My cell phone had no signal. The nearest town was miles behind me, and I had no idea how far ahead the road might go before reaching civilization. All around me, the forest waited. Then the scratching started again. This time it was coming from my truck itself. Slow, deliberate scrapes along the metal, like fingernails testing the surface. I turned on my dome light and peered out the windows, but I could see nothing in the darkness beyond my headlights. The scratching moved to the roof, directly above my head. Long, slow drags across the metal that made my teeth ache. Something was up there, something with claws or fingernails, exploring my truck like it was trying to find a way inside. I reached into my glove compartment and pulled out a flashlight, my hands shaking as I clicked it on. The beam was weak, but it was something. I needed to see what was out there, needed to understand what I was facing. That is when I made my second mistake. I opened the truck door. The moment the door swung open, the scratching stopped. The forest went silent again, but this time the silence felt different. Expectant, like everything in those woods was waiting to see what I would do next. I stepped out of the truck, flashlight in one hand, my cell phone in the other, still hoping to find a signal. The air was cold and damp, thick with the smell of rotting leaves and something else. Something that reminded me of old meat left in the sun. I walked to the front of my truck and lifted the hood. Steam hissed out, and I could see that one of the radiator hoses had been torn. Not worn through or cracked from age, but torn, like something had reached under the hood and ripped it apart. A branch snapped behind me. I spun around, swinging my flashlight toward the sound, and saw them. 3 of them, standing just at the edge of my light. They were even worse up close than I had imagined. Their heads were grotesquely enlarged, bulging out in all directions like balloons filled with water. Their faces were human, but stretched and distorted, with eyes that sat too far apart and mouths that hung open, revealing broken teeth. Their bodies were stick-thin, covered in pale skin that looked almost translucent in my flashlight beam. But the worst part was how they moved. They swayed back and forth like trees in a wind, but there was no wind. Their movements were too fluid, too serpentine, like their bones had been replaced with something that bent in ways bones should not bend. We stared at each other across the small circle of light from my flashlight, and I realized they were studying me. Not with animal curiosity, but with intelligence. Calculating intelligence that was deciding what to do with me. More shapes moved in the darkness beyond them. I could hear soft footsteps, breathing, the rustle of bodies moving through underbrush. There were more of them out there. Many more. I backed toward my truck, but one of the creatures made a sound that stopped me cold. It was almost like speech, but broken, garbled, as if it was trying to form words with a mouth that no longer worked properly. "Stay," it said, the words stretched and distorted but unmistakable. "Stay with us." The other creatures began to make sounds too. A chorus of broken syllables that might have been words once. They were trying to communicate, I realized, trying to speak like humans, but their deformed mouths and throats could barely manage it. "Play," one of them said. "Wanna play?" "Hurt," said another. "Hurt the man." I ran. I sprinted back toward the way I had come, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly as I crashed through the underbrush beside the road. Behind me, I could hear them following. Not running, but moving in that horrible swaying motion, somehow keeping pace with me despite their twisted limbs. The forest seemed to go on forever. My lungs burned. My legs ached, but I kept running because I could hear them getting closer. Their broken voices called out behind me, words that sounded like encouragement or mockery. "Run, run, run," they chanted. "Run for us. Catch you soon. Fun, fun, fun." I stumbled and fell, scraping my hands on the rough asphalt of the road. My flashlight flew from my grip and landed several feet away, its beam pointing uselessly into the trees. As I scrambled to retrieve it, I heard them emerge from the forest behind me. When I turned around, at least a dozen of them stood in the road. Their pale skin seemed to glow in the weak light from my flashlight, and their enlarged heads bobbed and swayed as they watched me. But they were not attacking. They were just standing there, blocking the road back toward civilization, waiting to see what I would do. That is when I understood. This was a game to them. They had disabled my truck, herded me into the forest, and now they were playing with me. Like cats playing with a mouse before the kill, I picked up my flashlight and started walking forward, toward them. I had no choice. The road behind them was my only way out of these woods, and I was not going to die cowering in the dirt. They parted as I approached, creating a narrow corridor between their swaying bodies. I walked through them, feeling their eyes on me, hearing their broken whispers, smelling that sick, sweet scent of decay that seemed to follow them. But as I passed the last one, it reached out with a hand that had too many fingers, each one ending in a yellowed nail that looked more like a claw. It touched my shoulder, and I felt something cold and wet soak through my shirt. "Going home?" it whispered, its voice like wind through dead leaves. "No home now. This home. Our home." I jerked away from its touch and kept walking, not daring to look back. But I could hear them following at a distance, their footsteps keeping time with mine, their voices creating a chorus of broken sounds that might have been laughter. I walked for hours through those dark woods, my flashlight growing dimmer with each step. The creatures followed me the entire way, sometimes visible at the edge of my failing light, sometimes hidden in the trees, but always there. When I finally reached the gas station where this nightmare began, the sun was rising, and the creatures had faded back into the forest. The old man behind the counter looked at me with those milky eyes and nodded, as if he had been expecting me. "You made it out," he said. "Most do not." I wanted to ask him what he meant, wanted to demand answers about what lived in those woods. But all I could think about was getting home, getting away from this place, putting as much distance as possible between myself and the nightmare I had survived. I called a tow truck and waited 3 hours for my pickup to be hauled out of the forest. When it finally arrived, the driver took one look at the scratches covering every surface and whistled low. "Looks like something tried to get inside," he said. "Good thing you stayed in the truck." But I had not stayed in the truck. I had gotten out, had walked among those things, had felt their clawed hands touch my skin. And as I drove home on the interstate, windows up, radio loud, trying to forget what I had seen, I realized something that made my stomach turn. The smell was still with me. That sweet, rotting smell that had followed the creatures was in my truck now, clinging to my clothes, my skin, my hair. And no matter how many times I showered, how many times I washed my clothes, the smell would not go away. It has been 3 months since that night in the Ohio woods. 3 months since I encountered the Melon Heads and somehow walked away alive. But I am starting to think that maybe I did not really escape after all. The scratches on my truck have spread. New ones appear every few days, deeper and more deliberate than before. And sometimes, late at night, I hear that broken laughter outside my apartment window. Most disturbing of all, I have started to change. My reflection looks different in the mirror. My head seems larger somehow. My features stretched and distorted. My teeth feel loose in my mouth, and my fingernails have grown long and sharp without me noticing. I think they marked me that night in the forest. I think when that creature touched my shoulder, it did more than just leave a smell. It left something else, something that is changing me from the inside out. The doctors say there is nothing wrong with me. The blood tests come back normal. But I know what I see in the mirror each morning. And I know what I hear calling to me from the woods at the edge of town. "Come back," the voices whisper. "Come home to us." And the most terrifying part is that I want to. Some part of me, growing stronger every day, wants to return to those dark woods and join the creatures that live there. I am telling you this story as a warning. If you ever find yourself driving through rural Ohio, if you ever see signs for Kirtland or hear stories about things living in the forest, turn around. Go back the way you came, because the Melon Heads are real. And once they mark you as one of their own, you can never truly escape. The changes are accelerating now. My head feels heavy, swollen. My vision is blurring at the edges. And when I look in the mirror, the thing looking back is barely human anymore. I can hear them calling. It is time to go home. Story 9. Watchers of Colorado City. I should have never stopped in Colorado City, Arizona. But when your truck breaks down in the middle of nowhere at 2 in the morning, you take whatever help you can get. The mechanic who answered my late-night call had an odd way of speaking. Slow, deliberate, like he was choosing each word carefully. He told me to wait by the old gas station on the edge of town, and someone would come for me. What he didn't tell me was that I could be watched from the moment I crossed the city limits. 3 pairs of headlights appeared in my rearview mirror as soon as I entered Colorado City. They followed at a distance, never getting too close, never falling too far behind. When I pulled over at the gas station, they parked across the street. The engine stayed running, but nobody got out. The gas station was closed, its windows dark except for a single fluorescent light that flickered like a dying heartbeat. I sat on the hood of my disabled truck, checking my phone for the 100th time. No signal. Of course there was no signal. When I noticed the town itself was wrong. Every house looked identical. Same beige color, same small windows, same chain link fences. No decorations, no personality, no signs of individual life. Street after street of carbon copy homes stretching into the desert darkness. And in many of those windows, I could see figures standing motionless, watching the street. Watching me. A pickup truck finally pulled up to the gas station, and a man stepped out. He was tall, probably in his 50s, wearing work clothes and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. But it was his expression that made my skin crawl. Completely blank, like looking at a mannequin that had learned to walk. He introduced himself as Brother Jacob and told me he'd take a look at my truck. I popped the hood, grateful for any help. But as he worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't about helping a stranded motorist. This felt like an inspection. Other men began arriving. They came in pairs, parking their vehicles in a semicircle around us. None of them spoke to me directly, but they whispered among themselves in hushed tones, glancing in my direction every few seconds. I counted at least a dozen of them by the time Brother Jacob announced that my truck needed parts that wouldn't arrive until morning. The nearest motel was 20 miles back down the highway, but Brother Jacob assured me there was a place I could stay right here in town. A guest house, he called it. For visitors like me, I should have insisted on walking to that motel. I should have called for a ride, Signal or no signal. Instead, I climbed into Brother Jacob's truck, telling myself I was being paranoid. Small towns were just different. People were naturally curious about strangers. The guest house sat at the end of a dead-end street, separated from the other homes by an empty lot filled with scrub brush and broken concrete. It was the same beige color as every other building, but something about it felt more isolated, more deliberate. Like it had been placed there specifically to contain something. Brother Jacob handed me a key and told me breakfast would be ready at 6 sharp. Then he drove away, leaving me alone with the silence of Colorado City. Inside, the guest house was sparse but clean. A single bed, a small table, a bathroom with no window. The walls were bare except for a single framed photograph of a stern-looking man with piercing eyes and a long beard. Below the photo was a small plaque that read, Prophet Warren Jeffs, our eternal leader. That name triggered a memory. Years ago, I read news stories about polygamist communities in remote desert towns. Stories about child brides, excommunicated young men, and religious leaders who ruled their followers with absolute control. Stories about Colorado City. I tried to leave immediately. The front door wouldn't open. The key that had worked perfectly fine to get in wouldn't to turn the other way. I pulled and twisted and yanked at the handle, but the door remained sealed shut. The windows were painted over from the outside, thick black paint that made it impossible to see through. When I tried to break one with a chair, the glass didn't even crack. My phone still had no signal, but worse than that, the battery was draining impossibly fast. It had been at 70% when Brother Jacob picked me up. Now it showed 15%, and the numbers were dropping as I watched. I was trapped. The first night was the longest of my life. Every sound seemed amplified in the desert silence. Footsteps on gravel outside, whispered conversations I couldn't quite make out, car doors slamming at irregular intervals, and underneath it all, a low humming sound that seemed to come from the walls themselves. At exactly 6 in the morning, the front door clicked open by itself. Brother Jacob stood on the threshold with a plate of eggs and toast. Behind him, I could see more men gathered in the street, all wearing the same blank expression, all staring at the guest house with the patient intensity of predators watching prey. He set the food on the table and informed me that my truck parts had been delayed. It would be at least another day, possibly 2, maybe more. These things took time in a small community like Colorado City. People here moved at their own pace, followed their own schedule, their own rules. Over the following days, a routine emerged. The door would unlock at exactly 6 in the morning for breakfast. It would unlock again at noon for lunch, and once more at 6 in the evening for dinner. Each time, Brother Jacob would deliver food and updates about my truck. Each time, the updates got vaguer and less believable, but it was during the locked hours that I learned the truth about Colorado City. Through the painted windows, I could hear fragments of conversations. Men discussing assignments, schedules, territories to patrol. They talked about keeping the community pure, about protecting their way of life from outside corruption. They mentioned young men who had been cast out, families torn apart, children reassigned to new fathers when their biological parents fell out of favor with the leadership. Most chilling were the discussions about visitors like me. They kept detailed records. It seemed every outsider who passed through town was cataloged, monitored, evaluated. Some were allowed to leave after a brief stay. Others disappeared entirely, their vehicles found abandoned miles away in the desert, their personal belongings distributed among the faithful. The criteria for who stayed and who left seemed arbitrary, but gradually I began to understand the pattern. Single men with no family connections, no job that would be immediately missed, no social media presence that might raise questions about their disappearance. Men like me, they were collecting people. On the 4th night, I discovered why. The humming sound in the walls grew louder after midnight, almost musical in its consistency. Following it led me to a loose floorboard near the back corner of the room. Underneath, I found a small opening that connected to a crawl space running beneath the entire guest house. The space was narrow and filled with dust, but I managed to squeeze through it until I reached a ventilation grate that looked out into the basement of the house next door. What I saw there will haunt me for the rest of my life. Rows of beds filled the basement, each one occupied by a man roughly my age. They lay motionless, eyes closed, connected to IV drips and monitoring equipment. Their heads were shaved, and small surgical scars were visible behind their ears. The humming sound I'd been hearing was coming from machines that surrounded each bed, machines that pulsed with the same rhythm as their breathing. a medical facility hidden beneath an ordinary house in Colorado City. But these men weren't patients. They were specimens. I watched in horror as a team of medical technicians moved between the beds, checking vitals, adjusting equipment, taking blood samples. They worked with the efficiency of people who had done this many times before, documenting everything on clipboards and tablet computers. One of the technicians was Brother Jacob. At the far end of the basement, I could see an office area where several men in suits were reviewing files and discussing financial transactions. They pointed to charts and graphs projected on a wall-mounted screen, numbers that seemed to represent prices and delivery schedules. They were harvesting organs. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Colorado City wasn't just a polygamist community hiding from the outside world. It was a front for something much worse. They were luring isolated travelers into their guest house, keeping them sedated and monitored while they systematically harvested whatever organs were in demand on the black market. The young men who were excommunicated from the community weren't just cast out. They were the first victims, expendable members of their own society who could disappear without questions from law enforcement agencies that had learned to avoid interfering with religious communities. But business was apparently good enough that they expanded their operation to include outsiders like me. I had to escape that night. Getting back through the crawl space without making noise was nearly impossible, but adrenaline gave me strength I didn't know I had. Once I was back in the guest house, I began looking for anything that could help me break out. The painted windows were reinforced with steel mesh sandwiched between layers of glass. The walls were solid concrete disguised to look like drywall. Even the ceiling was reinforced with steel beams that would be impossible to breach without power tools. But the floor was different. The loose floorboard I discovered wasn't the only one that had been disturbed. Someone had done extensive work on the flooring recently, probably to install the crawlspace access point. If I could find the right spot, I might be able to create an opening large enough to escape through. Using a metal leg from the broken chair, I pried up floorboards one by one, working as quietly as possible. The wood was old and had been weakened by desert humidity, so many of the boards came up easier than expected. Underneath, I found not just empty space, but a tunnel. Someone else had tried to escape from this room recently, judging by the fresh tool marks on the concrete foundation. They managed to dig a tunnel that extended several feet beyond the guest house before hitting solid rock. But they also left behind something else. A cell phone, almost dead but still functional, and a handwritten note that made my blood freeze. If you reading this, they got me before I could finish. The tunnel goes under the fence but stops at bedrock. You'll need explosives to go further. Check the storage shed behind the gas station. Brother Jacob keeps supplies there. The combination is 1847. Don, to trust anyone in this town. They were all part of it. My name is David Martinez. Tell my family in Phoenix what happened here. The phone had enough battery life to send one text message, but I had to make it count. No signal meant I'd have to get closer to the edge of town, possibly all the way to the highway, before any message would go through. I spent the next 2 hours enlarging the tunnel, using the metal chair leg to chip away at loose concrete and sandy soil. By 4 in the morning, I had an opening just large enough to squeeze through. The tunnel emerged behind a cluster of scrub bushes about 50 yards from the guest house. I could see the gas station in the distance, dark and apparently deserted, but I knew the storage shed David Martinez had mentioned would be around back. Getting there meant crossing open ground where I'd be visible to anyone keeping watch, but I had no choice. In 2 hours, Brother Jacob would arrive with breakfast and discover my escape. Whatever I was going to do had to happen fast. The storage shed was exactly where I expected it to be, hidden behind the gas station building and secured with a heavy combination lock. The numbers 1847 opened it immediately, revealing a treasure trove of supplies that confirmed my worst fears about Colorado City. Medical equipment, surgical instruments, preservation containers designed for organ transport. But also, thankfully, road flares and a small container of diesel fuel that would serve my purposes perfectly. I had one chance to send a message to the outside world, and it had to be visible from the highway 20 miles away. The gas station's fuel storage tanks were located underground, accessible through a maintenance hatch near the building's rear wall. I soaked every road flare in diesel fuel, then placed them strategically around the tanks and inside the storage shed. When they ignited, the explosion would create a fireball visible for miles. But first, I had to get close enough to the highway to send that text message. I ran through the desert in the pre-dawn darkness, following the road that led out of Colorado City while staying far enough from the pavement to avoid being spotted by patrols. The phone in my pocket felt like it weighed 100 pounds, my only connection to a world that suddenly seemed impossibly far away. It took me 45 minutes to reach a hill that offered a clear line of sight to the highway. Finally, mercifully, I got a single bar of signal on David Martinez's phone. I sent one text message to the FBI tip line. Colorado City, Arizona, Oregon harvesting operation, guest house basement 911 emergency, David Martinez, Phoenix. Then I lit the first road flare and threw it as hard as I could toward the gas station. The explosion that followed turned the entire desert orange for several seconds. Even from miles away, the heat was intense enough to feel on my face. Car alarms started going off throughout Colorado City, and within minutes I could see emergency lights converging on the gas station from every direction. I kept running toward the highway, hoping the chaos would give me enough time to reach safety before Brother Jacob and his associates realized what had happened. But Colorado City had one more surprise for me. As I crested the final hill before the highway, I looked back to see not just fire trucks and police cars racing toward the explosion, but a convoy of black SUVs heading directly toward my position. They'd been tracking me somehow, probably with cameras or motion sensors I hadn't noticed in my desperation to escape. The highway was only half a mile away, but they'd be on me in minutes. That's when I heard the helicopters, two of them, coming from the direction of Phoenix, flying low and fast with searchlights that turned the desert landscape into day. Behind them, I could see a stream of additional emergency vehicles racing down the highway toward Colorado City. David Martinez, his family had gotten my message. The SUVs from Colorado City stopped when they saw the helicopters, their occupants apparently deciding that capturing one escape witness wasn't worth a confrontation with federal law enforcement. I watched from my hiding place behind a boulder as they turned around and headed back toward town. By sunrise, Colorado City was swarming with FBI agents, paramedics, and forensic teams. The basement beneath the house next to the guest house yielded 17 men in various stages of surgical recovery, including David Martinez, who was alive but barely conscious after weeks of forced sedation. The investigation that followed revealed a trafficking operation that had been active for over a decade, generating millions of dollars in illegal profits while hiding behind the protection of religious autonomy laws. Dozens of young men from the community had disappeared over the years. Their families told they'd been excommunicated and forbidden from seeking outside help. Brother Jacob and 47 other members of the community were arrested on charges ranging from kidnapping to murder. The leadership of the polygamist sect claimed no knowledge of the organ harvesting operation, but financial records told a different story. I testified at their trials, along with David Martinez and 3 other men who survived the basement facility. The defendants showed no remorse, even when confronted with evidence of their crimes. To them, we were outsiders, unworthy of the consideration they show their own people. Colorado City still exists, though under federal oversight now. Most of the families there were as much victims as anyone else, trapped in a system they'd been born into and too afraid to question. The children have been placed with relatives outside the community, given a chance at normal lives. But I still have nightmares about those identical houses, those blank expressions, those machines humming in the darkness beneath the desert. Sometimes I wake up convinced I can hear them, convinced I never really escaped, convinced I'm still lying on one of those beds while strangers decide which parts of me are worth the most money. The guest house was demolished as part of the federal investigation, but I drive past Colorado City sometimes when work takes me through Arizona. The town looks different now, more normal, with individual touches that make each house unique. Yet I never stop there, no matter how late it gets or how badly my truck might be running. Some places, once they've shown you what they really are, can never be safe again. Story 10. Phantom Clown returns. The ice cream truck music started playing at 3 in the morning, and that was when I knew my childhood nightmare had come back to find me. I was 8 years old in 1981 when the Phantom Clown terrorized Boise, Idaho. 37 years later, I moved back to my hometown thinking those memories were buried deep enough to stay dead. I was wrong about a lot of things that summer, but mostly I was wrong about thinking I could ever really escape what happened to my little sister. The first sign should have been the missing children reports on the local news. 3 kids in 2 weeks, all around the same age Sarah had been when she disappeared. All last seen playing in neighborhoods that bordered Riverside Park, the same area where the clown sightings had been concentrated back in the 80s. But I convinced myself it was coincidence, Child abductions happen everywhere, and Boise had grown into a real city since I left for college. Urban problems come with urban populations, I told myself. It had nothing to do with painted faces and promises of candy. I was working as a freelance journalist, renting a small apartment on the north side while I researched a book about unsolved crimes in the Pacific Northwest. The irony wasn't lost on me that I spent my entire adult life investigating other people's tragedies while running from my own. Sarah had been 6 when she vanished on a Tuesday afternoon in September 1981. She was playing hopscotch in our driveway when Mom called me in for lunch. When I came back outside 15 minutes later, Sarah was gone. Her chalk was still on the concrete, but she had disappeared completely. The police found her bicycle 3 blocks away, abandoned next to Riverside Park. There were conflicting witness reports about a white van with colorful decorations, about someone in costume who had been seen talking to children in the area. The investigation lasted 6 months and produced nothing but dead ends and false leads. My parents never recovered from losing Sarah. Dad started drinking heavily and Mom retreated into a depression that lasted until her death 10 years ago. I left Boise the day I graduated high school and swore I'd never come back. But here I was, 45 years old and sleeping in the same bedroom where I used to have nightmares about clowns coming through my window. The ice cream truck appeared in my neighborhood on a Thursday evening in late July. It was an old white van with faded paint and speakers mounted on the roof, playing a slow, distorted version of The Entertainer that made my skin crawl. The driver wore oversized sunglasses and a baseball cap pulled low, but there was something wrong with his proportions. His shoulders were too broad, his smile too wide. I watched from my kitchen window as children emerged from houses up and down the street, drawn by the familiar sound of the truck. This melody. They gathered around the vehicle with dollar bills and eager expressions, but something was off about the entire scene. The children moved too slowly, like they were walking underwater. Their faces were blank, emotionless, as if they were sleepwalking. And when the driver handed them ice cream, I could see that his fingers were too long, too pale, ending in what looked like painted nails. That night, I started researching the original Phantom Clown case. The Boise Police Department files from 1981 were surprisingly detailed. Between March and October of that year, over 200 children reported encounters with a man in clown makeup who approached them in parks, shopping centers, and residential neighborhoods. The descriptions were remarkably consistent across different witnesses and locations. White face paint, red nose, exaggerated smile painted in bright red lipstick. A colorful costume that seemed to change from encounter to encounter, sometimes a traditional polka dot outfit, sometimes a more modern tracksuit with rainbow stripes. Always the same promise of candy, money, or toys in exchange for getting into his van. What the police files didn't mention was how many children actually went missing during that period. I spent 3 days in the basement archives of the Idaho Statesman, cross-referencing missing person reports with clown sightings. The numbers were staggering. 47 children between the ages of 5 and 12 had disappeared from the greater Boise area during the 8 months when the clown was active. 47 kids, including my sister, and somehow the connection had never been made public. Most of the cases were classified as runaways or custody disputes. A few were attributed to accidents or family tragedies. But when I mapped the disappearances geographically, they formed a clear pattern centered around Riverside Park and the surrounding neighborhoods, the same area where the ice cream truck had been making its rounds. I decided to follow the truck on its next appearance, which came exactly 48 hours later. Same route, same distorted music, same unnaturally slow gathering of local children. But this time I was ready with a camera and a determination to get close enough to see the driver's face. The truck made 7 stops through my neighborhood before heading toward the older part of town near the park. I followed at a distance, watching as it picked up more customers along the way. Each group of children exhibited the same strange behavior, moving like they were hypnotized or drugged. At the final stop, a little girl with blonde pigtails approached the truck carrying a stuffed rabbit. She couldn't have been more than 6 years old, and something about her reminded me so strongly of Sarah that I felt physically sick. That's when I saw the driver clearly for the first time. His face was painted white, but the makeup was cracking and peeling, revealing something underneath that wasn't quite human skin. His red nose appeared to be sewn on rather than painted, and his smile extended far beyond the corners of his mouth, carved into his cheeks like a Glasgow grin. But it was his eyes that made me understand I was looking at something that had never been human at all. They were completely black, no iris or pupil visible, just two holes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. When he looked in my direction, those eyes fixed on me with an intelligence that was ancient and hungry and absolutely malevolent. The little girl handed him her stuffed rabbit and climbed into the van. I found myself running toward the truck before I consciously decided to move. I was screaming, waving my arms, trying to get the attention of other adults on the street. But no one seemed to see what was happening. Parents stood on their porches watching their children interact with the ice cream truck as if everything was perfectly normal. The van drove away before I could reach it, but not before the thing wearing clown makeup turned to look at me one more time. This time, his painted smile moved, stretching wider until it nearly reached his ears. He raised one pale hand and waved at me with fingers that had too many joints. I wrote down the license plate number, but when I called it into the police, I was told no such vehicle was registered in Idaho. The number belonged to a sedan that had been scrapped 15 years ago. That night, the little girl with the stuffed rabbit was reported missing. Her name was Emma Hartwell, and she lived 4 blocks from where I watched her climb into the ice cream truck. Her parents told police she'd been playing in the front yard when they last saw her. They mentioned hearing an ice cream truck in the neighborhood, but couldn't remember anything specific about it. When I tried to tell the investigating officers what I witnessed, they looked at me like I was describing a hallucination. One of them actually suggested I seek counseling for trauma related to my sister's disappearance decades earlier. But I wasn't crazy, and I wasn't reliving old trauma. Something that had been feeding on Boise's children in 1981 had returned, and it was using the same methods to hunt new victims. I started patrolling the neighborhoods where the truck had been active, armed with a digital camera and a growing sense of desperate urgency. If the police wouldn't take me seriously, I'd have to gather enough evidence to force their attention. What I discovered was worse than I imagined. The thing driving the ice cream truck wasn't just taking children randomly. It was following a specific pattern, targeting kids who matched certain criteria. All of the missing children were between 5 and 8 years old. All of them had been playing alone when they disappeared, and all of them had been described by their parents as unusually quiet or withdrawn in the weeks before their abduction. It was selecting the vulnerable ones, the lonely ones, the children who wouldn't be missed immediately or whose disappearances could be easily explained away. Just like Sarah had been, on the 4th night of my surveillance, I finally got the proof I needed. The ice cream truck appeared on Elm Street just after sunset, its warped melody echoing off the houses like a funeral dirge. This time, I was positioned close enough to record everything that happened. The video I captured shows something that defies rational explanation. Children emerged from their homes and walked toward the truck, but they cast no shadows despite the bright streetlights. Their movements were perfectly synchronized, like they were being controlled by the same puppet master. And when they reached the truck, instead of handing over money for ice cream, they each placed their hands on the side of the vehicle. Where their palms touched the metal, dark stains appeared and spread like ink in water. The thing in the driver's seat was absorbing something from them, feeding on some essential part of their life force. I could see the children becoming paler, more transparent, as the feeding continued. Several of them collapsed before the process was complete, but the most horrifying part of the recording was what happened at the end. As the truck prepared to drive away, a small face appeared in the rear window. A little girl with blonde hair and a blue dress, pressing her hands against the glass and mouthing words I couldn't hear. It was Sarah, my sister, exactly as she looked the day she disappeared 37 years ago. She was still 6 years old, still trapped in that vehicle with whatever thing had taken her, still trying to escape after decades of captivity. The truck drove directly toward me as it left the scene, and I could see other faces in the windows. Dozens of children, all around the same age, all wearing clothes from different eras. Some of the outfits looked like they were from the 50s or 60s, others from more recent decades. The Phantom Clown had been operating much longer than anyone realized, collecting children across multiple generations while somehow remaining young enough to continue hunting. I tried to follow the truck, but it turned down a dead-end street and simply vanished. One moment it was there, the next moment I was staring at an empty road that terminated at a chain-link fence. But I knew where it was going. Riverside Park had been built on the site of an old cemetery, relocated in the 1920s when the city needed space for development. Most of the bodies had been moved to other burial grounds, but local records suggested that dozens of graves had been left behind, forgotten beneath the playground equipment and picnic tables. If something supernatural was using Boise as a hunting ground, it would need a base of operations connected to death and loss. A place where the boundary between the living world and whatever lay beyond was already thin. I arrived at the park just after midnight, armed with a flashlight and the terrible certainty that I was about to discover where the missing children had been taken. The playground was empty, but I could hear the distant sound of carnival music coming from somewhere underground. Following the sound led me to a maintenance shed at the far end of the park, its door standing open to reveal a staircase that descended into darkness. The stairs were old, much older than the park itself, carved from stone and worn smooth by decades of use. They led down to a network of tunnels that shouldn't have existed beneath the city, passages that connected to chambers filled with circus equipment from another era. And in the largest chamber, I found them, rows of children sitting on bleachers, watching a performance that had been going on for decades. They applauded in perfect unison while the thing that had once been human capered and danced in the center ring, its painted face shifting and changing with each movement. Sarah was in the front row, still 6 years old, still wearing the clothes she disappeared in 37 years ago. When she saw me, her face lit up with recognition, but she couldn't speak. None of them could speak. They were trapped in a perpetual audience, forced to watch the same nightmare performance for eternity. The clown stopped dancing when it noticed me, its black eyes focused on my face with predatory intensity, and its impossible smile stretched even wider than before. It had been waiting for me, I realized, waiting for the one witness who had never stopped looking, never stopped believing. It wanted to complete the set. I don't remember how I escaped from those tunnels. I don't remember running through the park or driving home or locking myself in my apartment. The next thing I knew, I was sitting at my kitchen table with the sunrise streaming through my windows and the sound of children's laughter echoing in my ears. The ice cream truck was parked across the street, and Sarah was standing beside it, still 6 years old, beckoning for me to join her. I could see other faces in the truck windows now, all the missing children from 1981 and all the children who had disappeared since then. They were smiling and waving, inviting me to become part of their eternal audience. The phantom clown was visible in the driver's seat, no longer bothering to hide his true nature. His painted face had cracked completely, revealing the ancient thing underneath. Something that had been collecting children for longer than Boise had existed, longer than Idaho had been a state. Something that had finally come for the one that got away. I am recording this confession because I know I want to be able to resist much longer. Every night, the truck gets a little closer to my door. Every night, Sarah looks a little more real, a little more like the sister I lost and never stopped missing. The phantom clown of Boise never really left. It just learned to be more patient, more careful, more selective about its hunting. And now it is offering me the chance to be reunited with my sister, to join the audience that never gets to leave. I think I'm going to accept the invitation. If you, re-listening to this, Don, to try to find me. Don, to go looking for the maintenance shed in Riverside Park or the tunnels underneath. Some disappearances are meant to be permanent, and some audiences are never supposed to disperse. But if you hear ice cream truck music playing in your neighborhood after dark, keep your children inside. Keep them safe, because the phantom clown is always looking for new performers, and the show must go on. That's where we leave the town tonight, but the stories never really stop. They just wait in silence for someone willing to listen. If you haven't yet, subscribe and hit that bell so you don't miss the next night we spend together. Tell us in the comments where you're from, or share a story that's haunted your hometown. Midnight Whispers thrives on the tales people carry with them. Until we meet again, leave a light on, because some towns never truly sleep.